We're still discussing other types of sampling. We talked last time about simple random sampling, and we even used our calculators to make a simple random sample using the random number generator feature. So now let's talk about some other sampling methods that are effective. So the first type of method we're going to discuss is called stratified sampling. So a stratified sample is obtained by separating the population into non-overlapping groups that we call strata. And then we obtain a simple random sample from each stratum. Now this is another one of those words. Stratum is singular, strata is plural. So the individuals in each stratum should be homogeneous. Or homogeneous, which just means similar in some way. So if you've ever taken a survey, they usually want to know whether you're male or female and your age range, and that's usually so they can group you in categories. So the advantages of stratified sampling over regular simple random sampling is that it may allow fewer individuals to be surveyed while obtaining the same amount or more information than the simple random sample would give us. Also, it guarantees that each stratum, so each group we make, is represented in the sample. So that's a stratified one. The next one we want to talk about is a systematic sample. So a systematic sample is obtained by selecting every kth individual from the population. So every kth just means pick a number. It could be every other person, every third person, every 10th person, however we want to do it. The first individual corresponds to some number between 1 and k. So say I'm going to line up the class and I'm going to pick every third person. My k is 3, so my first person that I pick would be some randomly generated number between 1 and 3. So the advantage of systematic sampling over the simple random sample is that systematic sampling does not require a frame. And all a frame is a list of every individual in the population. To accurately represent the population when we use a systematic sample, you have to pick an appropriate number for K. So how do you decide what K should be? Well, first we estimate the population size. And we use a capital N to tell us, to represent how many people are in the population. Then we determine what we want the sample size to be. And of course, we've already mentioned back in chapter 5 that sample size is a lowercase n. So then to figure out what K needs to be, we just take the population size and divide it by whatever we want our sample size to be. And we'll talk about how all these work more in a minute. So a third type of sampling is called a cluster sample. And we obtain that by selecting all individuals within a randomly selected group or collection, it could be either, of the individuals. So to accurately represent the population when you use a cluster sample, you need to determine if the clusters are homogeneous, remember that just means everybody in that group has a similar characteristic, or if they're heterogeneous. And heterogeneous means they don't have some similar characteristic that they share. If the clusters are homogeneous, then we should sample more clusters with fewer individuals in each cluster. But if the clusters are heterogeneous, then we should sample fewer clusters with more individuals from each cluster, or in each cluster. Okay, let us move on to the fourth type of sampling, which is what we call a convenience sample. So a convenience sample is one in which the individuals are easily obtained and is not based on randomness. So the most popular type of convenience samples are those in which the individuals in the sample are self-selected, or we also call it voluntary response. So this is pretty much every survey you will ever see. Any survey on a website, because you choose whether or not to participate in that survey, right? So in convenience sampling of the self-selected or voluntary response kind, the individuals themselves decide whether or not to be included. There's nothing forcing you to fill out that survey. So examples, as we've said, of this type are internet polls, or The kind, where you call into a news station, or even where they call you and ask you to do a survey. You decide whether or not you want to do that, and so either you answer the questions or you hang up on them. So convenience samples are not likely to be representative of the population. I can give you a very good example of this. I used to work a long time ago for a market research firm, and I was one of those annoying people that got to call you at dinner and try to trick you into doing a 5-minute survey that would really take as long as 2 hours. One of the companies we did surveys for was Cricket Phone Company. And I don't know if they're still around, but at the time they were a very cheap cell phone option for people who couldn't afford the fancy, expensive things. Cell phones. So we would call people and ask them how happy they were with Cricket. The majority of our responses were people that were very, very angry at Cricket for one reason or another. Either they said the service was terrible, or they didn't like their phone selections, whatever it was. We had a very few people that said they absolutely loved Cricket. What we did not really have was people who didn't care one way or the other particularly. So with voluntary response samples, you tend to get skewed information because people that choose to respond to the survey either really hate the product or they really love the product. So you don't get a broad base that's representative of everybody. So in practice, most large-scale surveys, obtain their samples using a combination of those strategies we just discussed. And this is what we call multi-stage sampling. So, for example, the way the Nielsen company does its TV ratings is that they divide the country into strata. Based on geographic area. And then they pick $6,000 of those strata randomly. And the important part here is that the strata are picked randomly. Then they list all the households in each of the 6,000 strata. And choose households by a simple random sample. So they've combined a stratified sample with a regular simple random sample. Some of what the U.S. Census Bureau does is even more complicated. Not for the decennial or once every